Hi there, and welcome back to our video on the evolution of life on land. Today we'll cover the evolution of invertebrate animals on land, which gives me the opportunity to include this great entomology versus etymology joke from XKCD, especially nerdy humor, which I appreciate. So, again, if you watched the plant video, you would have heard some of these. So what kind of challenges would invertebrate animals need to overcome in order to live on land compared to their aquatic relatives? Many of the challenges are the same as those we've discussed for land plants, and you'll also see in this video that many of the solutions actually end up being very similar too. So for one, air is dry compared to water. An obvious statement, but one that has important implications for how animals breathe on land. And second, air is less supportive compared to water, so this affects what animals need to be able to walk on land. There are others, but we're just going to focus on these two. So what kind of invertebrate animals live on land? Well, invertebrates are animals without bones, and some familiar and perhaps less familiar terrestrial invertebrates include the ones pictured here. Some of these groups are exclusively terrestrial, while others have species that also live in the ocean. So let's look at how some of these organisms have dealt with life on land, focusing on the arthropods, the things in the top row of photos here. So in marine animals, they either breathe by having the oxygen diffuse, which is kind of like a passive spreading through their body surface. Basically, the oxygen just kind of filters through their skin, more or less, or through external gills, which are the feathery things in the photos here. So a few land animals do this too, like earthworms, for example, but it's not the greatest strategy, and it means that the animal needs to stay wet all the time for oxygen to be able to move from the air into the body. So instead, many terrestrial animals and all terrestrial arthropods have brought their respiratory or breathing systems inside the body, connected to the outside by small openings, usually called spiracles. And so their bodies are also enclosed in a tough exterior that prevents water loss. And so if you recall the previous video on plants, this general idea of having kind of a waterproof exterior with small holes to let air inside might sound kind of familiar. So the internal respiratory system is different in various arthropods. Some, like insects and myriapods and millipedes, centipedes, and a few others have a series of tubes called tracheae, which branch into smaller and smaller segments as they transport oxygen into the body. And others, like scorpions and spiders, have plate-like sort of filaments called book lungs, which are named because they're kind of just like sheets of paper in a book. So terrestrial organisms also need to support themselves while walking. And marine animals are more or less what we call neutrally buoyant, which means they basically just kind of float. That means they can walk on the tips of their legs, with most of their weight actually just supported by the water. And this spiny lobster here, you can see it's just standing kind of just on a couple of its feet, on its tiptoes a little bit. In contrast, terrestrial arthropods have to support all of their weight on their feet, although they don't weigh much, it's true, but they have these sturdy and segmented flexible feet, actually called a tarsus, but they're basically feet, you can think of them, and these feet rest flatter on the ground for stronger support. So let's look at the evolution of terrestrial arthropods. And within Arthropoda, there's a mixture of fully marine groups, fully terrestrial groups, and groups that have a mixture of some marine and some terrestrial. If we look at the phylogeny, the evolutionary relationships that are shown in a schematic way here, does it look like arthropods evolved to live on land just once or multiple times? Well, we know that arthropods first evolved in the ocean. They first lived in the ocean, and many continue to live in the ocean. So if we think that they started out all in the ocean, at what point in the phylogeny does the habitat shift from marine in blue to terrestrial in brown? Well, it appears that terrestriality evolved, say, within the chelicerates, perhaps sometimes before the arachnids diversified, although we'll look at this in more detail. Terrestriality also seems to have evolved in myriapods, millipedes, and centipedes, and probably in the insect, or I guess the hexapod stem group, There are some terrestrial ostracods and isopods, so it looks like it evolved at least once in each of those groups. So that means that terrestrial life evolved perhaps at least 5 times in arthropods, or maybe even more. So we're going to look at arachnids in more detail in a second, but first a quick look at some of the early fossils of what we know about some of the earliest terrestrial arthropods. So currently, some of the oldest fossils that we know of land animals are Myriapods, millipedes or centipedes, from the later part of the Silurian period and the early part of the Devonian period, about 400, maybe about as old as 425 million years ago. Here are some pictures of some of these early myriapod fossils. Now, so I've often talked, in this video and in previous videos about how fossils are a particular age or from a particular time period, like the Silurian. But how do we know that? Like, where do these ages and these names come from? Well, sedimentary rocks themselves cannot be directly dated in terms of how many millions of years old they are. But there are 2 ways that we can determine how old they are. The first has been around for more than 200 years now, and it's based on the fossils in the rocks themselves. Not any fossils, specific fossils. And from the early days of geology, the scientists recognized that certain fossils always occurred below other fossils when they looked at sequences of rock layers. And so over the centuries, geologists have found a lot of these orders of fossils, where this one comes first, and then this one, and then the next one. And therefore they developed a very detailed relative time scale based on the vertical succession of these index fossils. And this is where names like Silurian come from. These names have been around for nearly 200 years, some of them. Now, this relative timescale works best in rocks that formed in the ocean, where there are lots of these index fossils. It also does just give us a relative timescale. And so the knowledge about absolute ages, how many millions or billions of years old these rocks are, actually came quite a lot later. And getting an absolute age typically relies on volcanic deposits that might occur between the layers of sediment. And it uses minerals, such as these zircon crystals here, that are produced in the volcanic eruptions. Now, zircon is a commonly used one. They contain tiny amounts of radioactive uranium in the mineral, and that uranium will turn into lead kind of over a known time period. We know how fast it happens, and so scientists can measure the amount of uranium and the amount of lead, and then calculate when that zircon crystal formed in the first place. So in the case of these millipede fossils here, and I'm simplifying how this paper did it quite a bit here, but a layer, say just below the rock layer with the fossils, was dated to 425.4 plus or minus 4.8 million years ago. And because the fossils, the arthropods, are in a layer a little bit above these layer with the zircon crystals, they're going to be a little bit more recent or younger. So maybe 425 or 424 million, something like that. But we have a constraint on these. The lower fish bed, you can see, is between a layer at 426.5 and one at 425.4. So we know how old or young it could be. It's somewhere between those 2 ages. So these early millipedes do appear to have lived on land, as a lot of them contain evidence for spiracles, the small holes that let air into the internal breathing system. Others contain evidence for reproductive structures you would need to reproduce on land, and so forth. There's also an extinct group of arachnids called trigonotarbids that are also found in rocks as old as the Silurian, and these look kind of like spiders. They aren't real spiders. They're probably an extinct stem group related to living spiders, whip spiders, and whip scorpions. I'll show you a phylogeny later on that suggests where they might fit. How do we know these lived on land? Well, some exceptionally preserved specimens from the Devonian period, about 410 million years ago, actually have preserved book lungs in the bottom photo here. And these book lungs have a very similar structure to living terrestrial scorpions, or whip spiders and so forth. Finally, scorpions themselves also occur in Silurian rocks. Actually, although the overall body plan is very scorpion-like, They have the big pincer claws, so they likely had the stinging thing on a long tail. These Silurian and Devonian and fossils in general are most likely stem group scorpions and not in the crown group. However, going back to even to the late 1800s and early 1900s, there's been debate about whether these early scorpions really were fully terrestrial, or perhaps whether some of them were actually aquatic instead. And some of this debate has occurred because these early scorpion fossils are actually, or almost always in fact, are found in shallow marine rocks. For example, rocks that formed in shallow bays or lagoons along the coastline. So if they're found in these rocks, maybe they were living in these areas. So that could support a marine habitat for these animals. However, these fossil assemblages also contain other sort of more definitively terrestrial organisms, and so they were presumably washed into the environment via rivers. Maybe the scorpions were also washed into this environment by rivers. So there's some doubt whether the environment where the fossils were formed and ultimately ended up, whether that really necessarily has to be the original habitat. It's also been argued that some of these early scorpions had more of the peg-like legs similar to marine arthropods, without the sort of flat tarsus or foot that would provide the stable platform for support on land. However, other early scorpions, even some of these Silurian ones found in marine rocks, had a leg and a tarsus or foot quite similar to modern terrestrial scorpions. It's also not really clear whether these ones that supposedly have this more peg-like leg are actually some of the earliest scorpions. Perhaps they're just a species that actually ended up returning back to an aquatic habitat from a terrestrial ancestor. And we can't rule that out either. And finally, there's an early scorpion from the Silurian period with a preserved circulatory system that indicates that at least some of them had circulatory systems similar to modern terrestrial scorpions. Now, although the book lungs aren't preserved in this fossil, the rest of the system, the various sort of blood vessels and hearts and whatever, are pretty similar to what we see in the modern scorpions. So does that mean that these early scorpions, this evidence that they were actually terrestrial? Well, others have noted that horseshoe crabs, for example, which primarily live in the ocean, also have advanced circulatory systems that even let them make short trips onto land. So the line between aquatic and terrestrial can be a little bit fuzzy, probably was in these early ones. It might come out onto land for a short time, but mostly live in the ocean. So perhaps this circulatory system here isn't really the strongest evidence either way. So why does it matter whether scorpions first evolved on land or in an aquatic habitat? Well, let's look at a phylogeny here of arachnids, also including their close relatives, the horseshoe crabs. So today, all arachnids are terrestrial. And there's evidence that a bunch of the extinct ones, or perhaps most of the extinct ones, such as trigonotarbids here, were also terrestrial. So if the early scorpions were terrestrial like everyone else, then the simplest explanation would be that there was just one episode where terrestriality evolved, perhaps in the stem group of arachnids, and then all crown group arachnids were terrestrial. However, if scorpions had an independent evolution of terrestrial life, if the early ones were marine, well then it's more complicated. It might imply that the early crown group arachnids were marine or aquatic, perhaps living in lakes, and that the terrestrial lifestyle evolved multiple times within arachnids. Well, right now it seems more likely that terrestrial life probably evolved once, but the debate over early scorpion evolution does have important consequences for this. Well, that's it for today, so thanks for listening, everyone.